Good afternoon, everybody. Wonderful to have you all here today. Can you hear me okay? Do I have this? Okay. All right. Welcome to Global Hotspots. I'm going to check with the friends in the back to see if we're good. Okay. Well, my name is Sarah Shute. I have the pleasure of working as a managing director at the Wisconsin Alumni Association as we try in our role to engage alumni and friends with the wonderful resources of the university and help people feel connected and understand how the university continues to be relevant to us every day. And that is done largely, well, mostly through the work of our terrific faculty and staff who are constantly researching the latest and greatest news and information. And we have a wonderful person here today and a wonderful representative of that sort of research and outreach here. And I'll introduce him in just a minute. But I want to say thank you to our partners and friends with Plato, the Participatory Learning and Teaching Organization, who is our partner to help bring you this great lecture series, along with our friends at the Division of International Studies here on campus. It's our final Global Hotspots of the year, but we have every intention of doing this again together next year. So thank you, and thank you in advance for that. At this point, I would like to introduce our speaker today, Professor John Pevehouse, who is a professor in the Department of Political Science. And spring for me, in addition to warm, sunny weather and flowers, often means it's time for John Pevehouse to come back and give us an international relations update. We have really been grateful to him that since the first Arab Spring occurrence, he has graciously come back every year and given us an update on where things are at in the Middle East and what else is happening around the world that we need to have on our radar. And I probably embarrass him when I say this, but it is honestly like getting a White House briefing. Not that I've had a White House briefing, but if I were to have had one, I imagine the thoroughness and the ability to sort of explain everything that's going on would be very similar to this. But we are very grateful to him. We always love having him do our Global Hotspots and other talks. And just a little bit about him, I think most of you have seen him speak, but he is, I think, definitely a campus expert on international relations, American foreign policy, international organizations. He also is often quoted in media. I see his name out there as providing expert opinions. He teaches classes, like most faculty do, and I just learned from John that he is now the editor of the internationally known journal for international relations called International Organization. So he's doing that and representing our university well with that. I'm very happy for him that he has his two sisters and mother here today to hear what a great speaker he is. And so we will not delay any longer, but instead get started and join me in welcoming Professor John Pevehouse.
Thank you very much, Sarah. Thanks for having me back again to talk to you about international relations. I do have family here, so I have to behave. I'm a little more nervous than usual. So, you know, Sarah was right. I began talking in the series when the Middle East was we had all kinds of trouble in the Middle East, or at least tensions in the Middle East, both with Iraq and then going into the Arab Spring. But I'm probably not going to talk. I will talk some about Syria today. I want to talk a little bit about what's going on there. And in the Q&A, feel free. As you know, anything's fair game with me. And so we'll talk some about Syria. We'll talk a little bit about the now failed attempts of Secretary of State Kerry to try to forge some compromise in the Middle East between the Palestinians and the Israelis. I want to talk a little bit about this Malaysian airplane, which has disappeared, which I don't know where it's at. But I will say, I think there's been some really interesting geopolitical things in the background there that I just want to draw your attention to, because I think it's kind of interesting, because it's really shedding light on what I think the next 20 years to 30 years are going to look like in Asia with China and its neighbors. But I'm going to spend the bulk of my time and where I'll start today with the headlines from today, which are the Ukraine and Russia. Can everyone hear okay? Good? Okay, good. So we're going to start with Ukraine and Russia. We could start about 4 or 5 centuries ago when the Ukraine, the territory as we know as Ukraine today, was largely divided at that point, kind of really almost down the middle. The western part of Ukraine, if you've been watching the news, as you now know, tends to look pretty much west. They do this because they were part of the Habsburg Empire centuries ago. And so they've always had folks who live in the Ukraine have always had this sort of more Western-looking outlook because of the Habsburg and the influence of the Habsburg Empire in that area. Of course, on the eastern side, these tend to be folks who are more ethnically Russian. Russia, in fact, under Stalin, moved a number of ethnic Russians to this area to try to make sure that Ukraine would stay part of the Russian Empire, the Soviet regime at the time under Stalin. And we'll talk a little bit about why, because Ukraine is a pretty important state, both in terms of its geographic location and its location on the Black Sea, and also the fact that the Ukraine actually has more arable land than any country in Europe. So it's potentially the most agriculturally important country in that region. And Russia covets that. Russia covets, of course, their access to the Black Sea. And so we'll talk about why Putin may be interested in this territory. We'll also talk a little bit about, in a minute, we'll talk about sort of the economic implications of what's going on, the sanctions, and then a little bit about American public opinion. But again, so you've had these divisions for centuries within the Ukraine, and this kind of division amongst the Ukrainian population. You saw this really come to the fore in 2004, which is when the Orange Revolution breaks out. And if you remember now, it's a decade ago. You had the president of Ukraine at the time in 2004, Yanukovych, that name should sound familiar, was ousted in a popular rebellion. Led by, among others, Yulia Tymoshenko. And Tymoshenko, who's the woman with the braids, led this revolt along with a couple allies. And Yushchenko steps down in 2004. And then Ukraine kind of dropped off our radar screen in the West. It kind of, we knew the Orange Revolution. We knew this was yet one more example where people power, democracy had prevailed, yet then it kind of drops out of view. Well, what was going on while it was out of view was the same tensions you see today between East and West Ukraine were playing themselves out in a much more quiet fashion, if you will. The individuals in the East, with the pro-Russian sentiment, rallied and tried to build support back for Yushchenko coming back. Those in the West who had been victorious in the short run for the Orange Revolution were trying to integrate themselves with Europe, which made the folks in the East very unhappy. So again, this was all kind of under the radar screen, but it was happening, and you had very contentious politics within the Ukraine. You had Russia, of course, at the time led by Medvedev, not Putin, supporting a resurgence of the pro-Russian sentiment and the pro-Russian parties, giving them funding and political advice. It turns out the Russian mafia was also becoming quite active in the eastern Ukraine. That's important for some of the things you see happening today, which I'll get to. Russia's kind of digging in the east. The West is digging in the West. The EU in particular is digging in the West. And this sets the stage for another election in 2010. I believe it was the summer of 2010, when Yanukovych, the person who's previously been run out by the Orange Revolution, comes back and becomes reelected. One of his first moves in office is to arrest the leaders of the former party, to arrest Yulia Tymoshenko. Now, you will read a lot about all of these individuals. None of these folks are angels, right? Let's get that out right now. Tymoshenko, all these folks who were in kind of what would be viewed as the pro-West opposition, they did some bad things, and they jailed supporters, and they embezzled money, and they engaged in high-level corruption. They were also doing the exact same thing that Yanukovych had done before that. So, and Yanukovych kept doing that when he came back in office in 2010. So again, no one really has clean hands, and you'll see a lot of commentators say this. They'll say, well, the problem is the West doesn't have any, the West broader, more broadly speaking, the EU, doesn't have any great allies. That's kind of true, but it's also now, I think, becoming more beside the point. So as of 2011, you had a lot of the opposition members arrested. Then 2012, what happens is that Ukraine announces essentially that it's in really deep economic turmoil. It's got high levels of debt. They're under deep economic duress. In a sense, they were kind of suffering from a delayed Great Recession. The Great Recession hits the United States 2008, 2009. The Ukraine also their economy kind of fell off in 2009. But there was kind of a delayed reaction. So it was more like 2011, 2012, when they really hit the bottom. And so, of course, what happens? Well, the folks in the East want to reach out to Russia. And by this time, President Putin, again President Putin, we should say, reaches out with a loan package to them, as does the EU, right? And of course, those individuals who are more kind of Western-oriented, pro-EU, say, let's take the money from the EU. And so there's an agreement signed between the EU and the Ukraine, but there's also an agreement signed between Ukraine and Russia. So they're trying to take it kind of from both sides here. So the most recent round of chaos really breaks out this last fall, I believe it was November, when Yanukovych, the president, the pro-Russian president, says, you know this agreement we had with the EU, we don't want it anymore, right? We don't want your money. We're not interested in trading with you as much anymore. We're casting our lot in with Russia. So of course, this makes the Western-oriented parties, kind of the pro-European parties, incredibly upset. And this is when you start seeing protests. This is when they occupied the main square in Kiev. The opposition occupies the main square in Kiev. You start seeing them trying to occupy military buildings in the western part of the country. And you know, this is November, December, things look like they're dying down. January, they heat up again. The Olympics happens, right? And everyone's watching Sochi. And of course, Putin behaves very well while everyone's got their eye on him. But nonetheless, even during the Olympics, if you'll recall, there was a lot of controversy over what was going on, and Ukraine, Russia pushing, particular outcomes in the Ukraine. And so Ukrainian athletes, right, considered boycotting at one point mid-Olympics. But nonetheless, it looked like things were going to play themselves out because Yanukovych resigns. So at the height of these protests, when it looks like the military might actually move against these protesters and kill these pro-Western protesters, they back down. And Yanukovych resigns, and he leaves, and he goes to a town on the Russian border to kind of hide out. The opposition in parliament say, yay, you know, he's gone. We're going to have new elections. And in the meantime, during all this, by the way, Yulia Tymoshenko is released from prison. She becomes kind of a focal point for the opposition again to rally around. And so you've got now, right, exiled president who's in bed with Russia, and you've got political opposition in Kiev, in the capital, who it's kind of the pro-West side is kind of has some support now, because even people who were kind of neutral, if it's even possible, that's a narrow group in the Ukraine, but even people in the middle thought this was a dumb idea to kind of push away the EU. Like, they need the EU, they need the trade, the aid is a good thing. And so that's why things tipped against Yanukovych. He kind of went a little too far towards Russia. And so so there's going to be new elections. The prime minister takes over and says, we're going to have new elections. We're going to form a new government. In the meantime, the Olympics end. And Putin says, wait a minute, what about Yanukovych? He's still the president, right? He's just on vacation, right? He's just hanging out. And you know, the opposition is kind of dumbfounded, and they essentially say, no, look, he left, he's gone, right? We're having new elections, he's not the president anymore. Putin is saying, no, he actually still is a major player, and we might even move to bring him back and to support him. So you need to watch yourself, right? And makes these very intimidating statements towards the Ukraine and Yanukovych. Well, in the meantime, after there's a plan for new elections, and they're talking about, you know, kind of reorienting the government, kind of street level or village level rebellions start breaking out in the east, right? And in particular in the Crimea in the south, the island in the south, which is in the Black Sea. Kind of gives them those ports on the Black Sea. And of course, these are regions that are populated heavily by kind of those in pro-Russian sentiment. So think about it this way. You know, you had the government tilting towards Russia. That government leaves. You then have a government that's going to come in tilting towards the West. Just like the individuals rebelled in Kiev when the pro-Russian government was in, now the individuals in the East are going to rebel because there's a pro-Western government in Kiev, right? And you know, what had happened in the West with those rebels kind of occupying squares was pretty spontaneous. It was very much kind of ground up. There was no broader coordination of those efforts. In the East, you had something completely different. In the East, you had pro-Russian groups start that way, but then by all, you know, here I am treading a little bit on political ground, but to be blunt, in my opinion, you had Russia and Putin and a lot of his thugs kind of going in and arming these folks and actually helping them organize and helping them coordinate intelligence and helping them figure out how exactly they were going to cause trouble for this kind of new, quote unquote, Western government in the Ukraine. So this is when, for example, the leaders in Crimea all say, look, we're not part of Ukraine anymore, we want to be part of Russia. So so Crimea votes. And so Putin says, look, if we believe in democracy, let's have them vote. So there's a plebiscite, and they say, yes, we want to leave and go to Russia. Now, of course, what we've seen over the last few weeks is more and more of these pro-Russian groups springing up. Of course, again, if you believe, and frankly, I would believe, the media reports coming out, a lot of these are Russians. They're not just Russian ethnics who are Ukrainian, they are Russians who have come from Russia and been sent from Russia by the Russian military to try to cause trouble in some of these areas. They're the ones now starting to do just what the Western opposition had done in the West, which is occupy buildings, occupy town halls, occupy military bases, occupy checkpoints. And so that's kind of where we're at. If you read the news this morning, the Ukrainian military, which is controlled now by those pro-Western forces, engaged in a pretty heavy military offensive overnight to go in and try to root some of these folks out. It's estimated there are quite a number of both civilians and military folks killed in the last 24 hours. 2 Ukrainian military helicopters have been shot down. Putin has now said, Putin had made noise about a peace deal. He's now said that's off. All bets are off for any kind of peace deal that might happen. Merkel is today talking with Obama about what's next in terms of the West. And so things are, every time it looks like things might die down, things get tense, very tense, even more tense than they were. So what does all this mean? What does this mean from a big geopolitical sense? What likely outcomes are we going to see? So the first thing to think about is, well, what are Putin's goals? Like, what is he trying to do? There's kind of big geopolitical goals that you can think about for Putin. This is the man who, within the last 2 years, has been on record as saying the greatest tragedy, the greatest tragedy to befall the human race was the end of the Soviet Union. Right? That is his, now of course, could just be a lot of hot air, but that gives you a sense. Even if you're going to say that takes a lot of guts, right? Forget, the Holocaust or, World War II, right? It was the fall of the Soviet Union was the greatest tragedy to befall the human race. And so Putin really has these grand designs. How far he will go with them, I don't think he is another Stalin. I don't think he's another Hitler. I don't think we're going to see ground forces moving in heavily in, the Baltics anytime soon. But it's clear that he wants Russia to be respected. He misses that prestige and that power that Russia had during the Cold War. Right? And if you think about it, we all remember the Cold War. The Cold War was a time when that's the country you thought about first, right? When bad things happened, were the Soviets involved? What do we think about the Soviets, right? And even if the Soviets weren't directly involved, the first question we asked in American foreign policy was, well, if we do this, what are the Soviets going to do, right? We gave them a pride of place for good reason during the Cold War. Putin wants that back, right? When you hear international relations, he wants you to think Russia, not China, not Japan, not the EU. Right? And there are a lot of people, there are a lot of citizens of Russia who feel the same way. Right? They don't necessarily want to live back under the old Soviet system. They know that system was broken, but nonetheless they miss having that prestige, really. They miss having that prestige. And so that's kind of a big picture, I think, view to keep in mind as you think about Putin and what he does. Again, on a narrower sense, why the Ukraine? Again, I would point to those two things. Access to this warm water port. The Russian Navy has always coveted access to the Mediterranean. This is why having Turkey in NATO was such a thorn in the side of the Soviets, because they controlled the Bosporus. And so they've always wanted this access to the Black Sea. Well, when Ukraine became independent, they lost it. Right? Ukraine became independent. There's a massive Russian naval base in the Crimea near Sevastopol. And so what the deal that was cut with the help of the United States was that Russia would have access to this base, and in return, they would give deep discounts on oil and natural gas to Ukraine. Because eastern Ukraine, even though there's lots of agriculture in Ukraine, eastern Ukraine is heavily invested in mining and manufacturing, and they need oil, they need gas to run those plants. So what Russia said is, you give us access to this naval base, we'll sell you cheap oil and gas. Well, what does that, think about that today, right? In 2014, Ukraine doesn't have Sevastopol anymore. They don't control the Crimea. Crimea is now part of Russia. So the first thing Russia said was, well, no more cheap natural gas, no more cheap oil, right? Which only increased tensions in the last month between those states. So there is both a kind of a grand strategy issue here for Putin, and there's also the specific, like, Ukraine is valuable. It's a very valuable territory. And even if the Russians don't hold it proper, they want allies in control. They want to have heavy influence there. So that's kind of the Russia side of things. We're happy to talk more about that. On the Western side, on the US and the EU side, what's the position there? Well, obviously no one's happy about what's going on in terms of the threat towards the Ukraine. The Ukraine, when Timoshenko was in power, when the opposition was in power, they very much looked towards the EU. The EU and the United States provided a tremendous amount of aid to the Ukraine, economic aid to the Ukraine. The Ukraine trades a lot with the European Union, Russia as well. And so I don't think the media has talked enough about this, but the first response by the West, by Europe and the United States to what Russia has been doing in the Crimea and more generally in the Ukraine were sanctions, right? Very targeted sanctions. So the United States drew up a list. I can't give you the exact number. It's in the dozens. It's probably not in the hundreds, but it's certainly in the dozens. The BBC actually has a phenomenal little flow chart of like Putin and his cronies, and you can click on them and it tells you all about them and how many billions, multi-billions of dollars they control. So the US took that list and said, we're sanctioning those people. They can't travel. If they have lots of money in American banks, we're going to freeze those assets. They can't invest anymore in the United States. They essentially can't do business with the United States anymore. So we're trying to go right to Putin. Right? Now notice that's different than sanction episodes in, say, Cuba or Iraq or any of the other times the Americans use sanctions, which is, right, we limit trade or we embargo things to the whole country. We're not doing that. We're just saying there are a few individuals around Putin that we want to hurt with the idea, what are called smart sanctions, with the idea that we can get them to pressure him to change his ways because they're his main political allies. Not sure if it'll work, but that's the strategy. Europe has done the same, but they've been a little more hesitant to do more, and they will be hesitant to do more. And I think we're going to see if this crisis that started today escalates over the coming weeks, it would not shock me if you would see more tension between the United States and Europe about the response. The United States is willing to go far further, right? Obama is actually willing to place more general sanctions on the entire Russian economy, right? The dangers there, it hurts the Russian people, not the Russian leadership. That's another discussion. Obama's willing to go much further than we've gone. He's kind of holding it back in case I think he needs to do more. The Europeans, it's not clear how much more willing they are to do more against Russia. And here's why. If you look, Russia trades, and they're the ones that could, right? The EU holds the cards here. Let me get that. The EU holds the cards. Russia exports about $260 billion a year in goods to Europe, excluding fuel. There's the second closest after that is China, at about, I think it's 40 billion. After that, you get the Ukraine, ironically, is about third, with about 30 billion. Then it's like the US at 20 billion. So the US and Russia, 20 billion, we'd all love to have $20 billion, but that's not, in global trade, right, that's not a huge amount. And so it's the EU that has the leverage here. But of course, the EU also depends on Russian oil, and they depend on Russian gas. And they know that Putin can cut that off. And in the middle of what's still the recovery, right, from the global economic crisis in Europe, European leaders are very nervous about, for example, seeing the price of fuel skyrocket in the next year. This summer, Europe, this is something has not been in the media at all, but I think is really important to think about. Greece has had this terrible economic crisis, and the Germans have bailed them out twice. Greece issued a tremendous amount of 5-year bonds in 2009. To try to get out of the debt crisis, which means they're coming due this summer. So Greece has a huge bill coming due this summer, and they can't pay it. Even though they've recovered a little bit, they're still going to be in too much debt to pay it. Germany's going to have to bail out Greece again, right? Probably to the tune of $80 to $150 billion, right? Right, and of course, what's Germany going to do? They're going to pass the hat around to the rest of Europe to try to get as much as they can. They may or may not get anything in that hat, but they're going to pass the hat around. And so European leaders are saying the last thing we want to do is tick off Putin too bad because he's going to cut off fuel, which is going to drive the price of fuel up, which we're already going to ask for austerity again because of the Greeks amongst the population. We're going to cut education. We're going to cut all these things. And then to have fuel prices go up, it's political suicide, right? So they don't want to do that. That's going to cut off their nose to spite their face. So Europe's going to be very reticent to move further on sanctions unless Putin does something really bad and really stupid. And as much as we may not like Putin anymore, he's not stupid. And so, which I think in the end, kind of to move into what's going to happen, I would guess that over the next couple of weeks, Russia's going to use this crisis. Putin's going to use this current Ukrainian offensive to justify further intervention. He's not going to send in proper Russian troops, I don't think, but he's going to up the kind of private, he's going to up the kind of secret arms running. He's going to increase the amount of military advisors he's sneaking in across the border. And so this will come to a head in a couple of weeks. I actually have no good idea where it's going, but I don't think Putin is that brave because he knows now Europe is not that anxious to sanction. Okay, so that's I think the ins and outs of Ukraine to some extent. One question is how much would the U.S. public support doing more? I think the public's been very supportive of sanctions. A couple of interesting polls that have come out recently. Well, as you know, I'm always interested in kind of where American public opinion stands on these things. American public opinion, first of all, now if you ask kind of favorability ratings for Russia, they're almost back where they were in the Cold War. As a whole, the American public is now more and more viewing Russia as we did when it was the Soviet Union. And I think that's really, really interesting from a historical perspective. The second thing is that most Americans are not in favor of using, for example, military force to defend Ukraine. No one's arguing we need to go in guns blazing to try to save the Ukraine. Some people are much more supportive of using, arming, and more heavily arming the Ukrainians to defend themselves. That's a possibility. That also brings some risks, but that's a possibility. There was a poll published in the Washington Post about 2 weeks ago. It was done by a friend of mine, Joshua Kurtzer, who's at Harvard University. And what Josh found, this is kind of one of these disturbing things where you just have to shake your head. He asked, are you supportive of using military force in the Ukraine? And about 25% of Americans said yes, right? Only a quarter. It's not huge. Then he followed up and he said, how strongly do you feel about this? To people who were against and opposed. And on like a 10-point scale, they could say, 10, I feel we absolutely should not, or we absolutely should. So he took those 25% that said yes. He looked at how strongly they felt about this. It turns out of those 25%, let's say 8% were kind of like 7, 8, 9, 10. Like they felt really strongly. We need to go to war in Ukraine. Right. Question number 3 was, find Ukraine on a map for me. Of that 8% of the 25% of the whole sample, about a third of them put the Ukraine in the United States. And that was uniform across the board. The people who felt the most strongly about arming the Ukrainians and intervening in the Ukraine literally had no idea where this was. Many of those folks are the ones who put it in the United States or even Asia, right? So, kind of be careful who you listen to, I guess, is the line here. Okay, so we'll come back. If you have questions on Ukraine, really happy to talk more. But Sloviansk, I'd forgotten the name. Sloviansk is the name of the city where the fighting has been happening in the last 24 hours. Okay. Let me say something quickly about the Malaysia thing. We'll shift to Asia. The missing Malaysia flight. I think the most fascinating aspect, it's clearly a tragic event as this horrible, horrible ferry incident in South Korea. But I think the one geopolitical thing that's come out of somewhat both of these, but more the missing airplane, it's become clear that this massive search for this airplane, I mean, truly a needle in a haystack operation, really suffered from a lack of cooperation between a lot of the countries in the region. In particular, if you remember the opening days of this crisis, and I was shocked by the CNN, this has been CNN's thing, right? You cannot go on CNN. This is top of the news every day. Like why they picked this, it's to some extent, to some days, it's literally like the Ukraine is not happening on CNN. So this is their thing. Early on, China said, oh, we found it. And they didn't find it. And then China said again, we found it. And they didn't find it. And then China started to again say we found it. And they were like, no, don't do that again. And there's been some real blowback from this because, and China has a vested interest in doing this. There was mostly Chinese nationals on this plane, right? So the Chinese government is very interested in finding this plane because it's a political, domestic political issue for them. So, you know, but it became clear that the Australians and the Americans and the Chinese just were not, we were cooperating with the Australians fine, but the US military was not cooperating well with the Chinese and vice versa. And of course, the reason is we were using some really advanced sensing technology here, and we did not want the Chinese to see what that was or how it worked, and vice versa. They were doing the same thing. They were using their top-of-the-line technology, which, you know, clearly didn't work in 2 cases, to find this plane, and they couldn't do it. And China has gotten kind of a black eye. I mean, Malaysia certainly got a black eye from all of this. Their government handling of this has been incredibly inept in many ways, but the Chinese government, amongst those people who have been paying attention, has really gotten a lot of criticism, and I think rightly so, in that they kind of would, the minute they felt they found something, they would just throw this out, right? And of course, the media would then glob onto it. And then, as it was pointed out, neither of these locations that China's claimed they found the plane is even close to where we actually think it went down. And so it literally took potentially weeks off the search, and now we're really looking for a needle in a haystack. And so, you know, what quietly American diplomats are now going around Asia saying is like, look, they're incompetent, and B, right, they're in this for themselves, and you can't trust them, right? They don't trust us, you can't trust them. And so you hear a lot about the Asian pivot, right? What the Obama administration has labeled the Asian pivot, right? That our security concerns and interests need to really start to refocus on Asia, away from the Middle East, away from Europe. Ukraine's kind of throwing a crimp in that, but we need to pivot towards Asia because that's where the emerging threats are all going to become. So this fit in that narrative for Obama, right? It's kind of like, look, we've been telling you this is a dangerous situation. We don't need to go to war with China or anything, but just watch for their motives. And in a very small way, they were able to use this, I think, very effectively diplomatically. So not overshadowing the fact that this truly is a human tragedy, I think the Obama administration, I think, here has been pretty effective at actually using this on a diplomatic level as well. So we always talk about the Middle East a little bit. It's never good news. And so I'm afraid I can't come back to you with good news on this. Just 2 quick things here, and then I'll take some questions for a while. So as you know, John Kerry has been working very hard to try to reach an agreement between the Palestinians, the Israelis. It's not going anywhere at this point. Both sides have done, you know, both sides have undertaken some actions that have made the other side mad enough that it's off for now. That's unfortunate. So I had the pleasure and the honor of actually being in the region in December for a little while, and was able to have some chats with people from both delegations, from individuals from both delegations, and was able to have a long conversation with Dennis Ross about what's been going on, who for years was the mediator between the Palestinians and the Israelis, and even was able to have a short conversation with Martin Indyk. And you know what Indyk said, who is the main U.S. negotiator at this point, what Indyk said was he's never seen them so close. He said he's never seen them so scared, and he's never seen them so close. And you saw what happened, right? You saw what happens when you're close and scared, right? People make mistakes and then they blow up. So the question is, the blow up, how big is the blow up, right? Is this really going to push them back a long way? Or will they be able to kind of pick up somewhat where they left off? I think the folks that I've been talking to lately suggest that things are going to be off for a while. Like, don't expect anything next week, next month, this summer. But that there's enough groundwork that has been laid that both sides potentially are going to pick this back up. Now, don't be look, even if there's an agreement, agreements fall apart, agreements don't get enforced, agreements are cheated on, who knows, right? And so, but an agreement nonetheless would be significant. Many people on both sides really applauded John Kerry. It's funny, in the US, he was sort of viewed as a fool, right, for taking this on. Like, why do you think you're the one who's going to bring peace to the Middle East? And he got a lot of derision in the United States. Now, publicly, Palestinians and Israelis both have a lot of negative things to say about Kerry, agree or disagree with what they say. But privately, they really respect what he was doing. They said he was engaging in a level of depth and study and listening that they had not had for several administrations, both Democratic and Republican. And so I was shocked. And because I was so used to getting the typical American view on this, I kind of thought they're going to tell a lot of jokes about John Kerry, but they didn't. They really had a lot of respect for him and felt like he was trying to push the process forward in good ways, and that he really was listening and really was attuned to what was going on. So from that perspective, the fact that he's publicly stood up and said, "I'm done, I'm walking away," that was both a sign of his frustration, but it was also, I think, kind of a shot across the bow to both sides, essentially saying, look, I don't have endless patience. Like, you guys need to get over this, and we need to either move on or just call it quits. And who knows? I want to talk about Syria, but let me just bring up one other thing about the Israeli-Palestinian talks. The bitter irony here, right, is that if you talk to folks who actually live in Israel, live in the West Bank, even live in Gaza, they will tell you, like, look, peace is going to be an uneasy peace, but everyone needs the peace in the long run. In the short run, neither side actually needs peace, and that's the problem, and that's why it keeps blowing up. Neither side needs peace. Israel's doing fine. 30 years from now, they're not going to be doing fine at all. But they're doing fine for now, and the Palestinians are doing fine, trying to kind of make their way. They're getting lots of European investment. They'll be fine. But in the long run, everyone knows they need an agreement. And they probably need it sooner rather than later because they know there's some big changes coming. And so happy to talk more about those, but there's demographic changes coming on both sides. There's major economic changes potentially coming in Israel, which they're very concerned about. So peace would be a good thing, yet in the short run, I don't think it's in either side's interest, so they're not going to pursue it. Long run, who knows? Let me shift north and talk about Syria just for 1 minute. The last time I talked to you last spring, I think, this will show you how much you should listen to me, which is 0. I said, Assad's days are numbered. And now it looks just the opposite, right? No one's going to get this guy out of power. And I would blame my completely incorrect prediction on the fact that right as it looked like the opposition was actually making some major inroads against the Syrian army, they got greedy amongst themselves, right? So it's kind of one of these, the enemy is my friend, and they didn't like each other, but they liked Assad less. And right when it looked like they might actually tip the balance and get Assad to back down, or at least engage in some power sharing, they started thinking about the next stage of the game, which was, okay, among us, how are we going to divide the power? Oh, I forgot, I don't like you. And they started fighting one another. And so you had Sunni militants coming in from Iraq fighting, you had militants coming in from Lebanon, you had folks coming in from Afghanistan, you had folks coming in from Chechnya, right? So the crazy thing is, Assad, when he says there are a lot of foreign terrorists coming in and fighting for the opposition, he's actually right. He's absolutely right. There are a tremendous number of foreign terrorists coming in and fighting and causing chaos in Syria. Of course, his own military forces are wreaking just as much havoc in the country, but he's actually right when he says that. So it's this classic, I laid this out, I think, last year. This was the classic Obama problem, or tension between, we don't like Assad, but we know a lot of these guys fighting Assad are in league with al-Qaeda, or at least al-Qaeda in Iraq and the Levant. And so we don't want to arm them too well, because then they'll probably use these weapons against us. See Afghanistan, 30 years ago. And so, so as a result, the U.S. never gets that deeply involved in Syria. Assad, in the meantime, Bashar Assad used this division among the opposition to divide and conquer, and that's exactly what he did. He kind of took off one group at a time, one village at a time. As of yesterday, they announced there's Homs was one of the key centers of the opposition. Homs was a city that was held from very early on by the opposition, very strongly. The Syrian army is going to enter this weekend, and they're going to allow the opposition fighters to leave peacefully. We'll see if that happens. But then the army's going to control Homs, right? A year ago, no one would have predicted that. And it's because the Islamic Front for Iraq and Syria started fighting some of the more secular Syrian groups, which started fighting some groups that had moved in from Lebanon, and they killed each other, and then on the spoils of that, in went the Syrian army. And so that's why Syria has the broad brush picture as to why Syria has kind of taken the evolution that it has, is that they saw what they were about to win, and they couldn't agree amongst themselves as to what was going on. And it's not just, it was both happening from within, but also without. Other groups from outside the country, in Iraq, again, in Lebanon, in Chechnya, said, hey, we're about to be able to come to power in Syria. In they came. And then they divided, and Assad took advantage of that. So a year ago, certainly 2 years ago, no one would have guessed that in the summer of 2014, Bashar Assad would be the president of Syria. But that's where we're going to find ourselves in the summer of 2014. I think that's it for now. I'm sure there are other regions we can talk about, other questions if you have them. Be more than happy to discuss those issues. Thanks as always, and I look forward to your questions.
Thanks, John. We'll pass the microphone around and just talk into it so everybody can hear your question.
You said that Israel and Palestine are both very scared. Could you elaborate on what they're so scared about now?
Well, now they're scared. There's a lot of folks in both countries that are nervous about the peace and what the peace is going to look like. I can tell you a couple of the sticking points right now. It's partially the settlements and the extent to which the settlements will be abandoned. Although they've got 95% worked out. They've got land swaps. They've got most of that figured out. I won't say they've got most. I should say they've got most of it figured out. They've got 95% of this figured out. It's just the last 5%. But of course, then, right? What does an Israeli prime minister have to think? The solution they're talking about, essentially is going to keep a fair number of the settlements, but also get rid of some of the settlements. And just like when they got out of Gaza, right? That takes a lot of tremendous political authority within Israel to convince settlers, sometimes to get out of this territory. On the Palestinian side, so the other thing that the Israelis want in response for taking some of their settlements out is they want aerial superiority over the Jordan Valley, right? Israel wants to make sure that no one's going to sit in the Jordan Valley and fire rockets, right, in. Fair, sure. But then how to do that, right? Because the preferred Israeli position that started was, well, we'll just keep our military in the Jordan Valley. And the Palestinians like, no, right? The whole point is you're getting out, right? And so the Palestinians suggested an international force. The Israelis were not too hot on that. That's not actually a good option for a variety of reasons. And so what they're trying to figure out now is how to keep kind of aerial superiority to make sure these kind of rocket attacks, because they have happened, and we know they've happened. And it's a danger for Israel. On the Palestinian side, look, where does Hamas derive a lot of its legitimacy from? It derives its legitimacy from the fact that they're the opposition. They're the ones firing the rockets into Israel, right? And if there's peace with Israel, and all of a sudden, say, the economy starts growing and things start getting good, where's their legitimacy going to be derived from? This is many people looked on this agreement a couple weeks ago between Fatah/the PA and Hamas, right, between these two Palestinian groups, as Hamas was weak, Fatah was weak, the Palestinian Authority was weak, and they needed Hamas's help. I think it's just the opposite. I think Hamas is weak right now. Hamas is very weak. They don't have their sponsor of Syria anymore. Iran is having trouble getting things to them because they used to run it through Syria, and they can't get weapons through Syria right now. Hamas is weak, and Hamas is scared. Both American and Israelis and Palestinians told me point blank, the PA has never been stronger. Like, they've never been more able to make peace right now. I think this was a way for the PA, this was probably bad timing on there, but this was a way for the PA to try to pull some of that legitimacy out from under Hamas. That's putting a good spin on it. Others would put a completely different spin, by the way, that this is Hamas trying to take over and infiltrate, right, and bring a more violent Islamic movement into the PA. Time will tell. I think time will tell. But I think that's the scared part. The other thing that's scary, right, for Israel, to be blunt, Kerry pointed this out the other day and got a lot of flack for it. Jews are getting ready to be a minority in Israel, and that's a problem. That's a major problem. Because when you've got the majority of your population that are not on equal footing from a citizenship status, that starts to look bad. And there's ways you can spin it and justify it and whatever, but there are these demographic shifts. The other thing that scares the hell out of secular Israelis is the massive amount of the growing Orthodox movement there. The average secular Israeli has, I think, 2.3 children. The average Orthodox has about 12.2. And so you expand that population growth curve out. And right, what is it? What is the deal? What was Ben Gurion's bargain? Right, it was that you don't have to work, you don't have to do military service, and you study. Right, you study, and so you've got, if you project these out, you're going to have 25, 30% of the Israeli population not working, not doing military service, not contributing to the tax base. Right, how do you run a modern economy like that? And so that's a long run thing. You're seeing more secular individuals in Israel start to say, like, why aren't they doing military service, right? And the Knesset's been actually debating whether Orthodox should have to do military service, right? And that's just the first step. But again, that's all a huge domestic political football that's kind of being thrown back and forth right now.
I'd be interested in your thoughts on what's going to be happening in Egypt the next 5 to 10 years, given that, the obvious upheaval there and so on, but some of the underlying things, for example, financing, they're being supported by the Emirates and Saudi Arabia because those guys didn't seem to like the Brotherhood, which, from my perspective, seemed to be a moderate Islamic organization compared to what's taking the field now.
Right.
And they've gone to great lengths to suppress them, much like Mubarak did and before. And it seems that Egypt is going down the same path it went down before, only now, just to keep its head above water, is relying on its neighbors who sooner or later are going to decide, well, we don't need to do this anymore.
Right.
What's going to be happening there?
Right. They're going to decide they don't need to do it, or they themselves are going to experience some domestic turmoil, which is going to undermine their government support for Egypt. So you're right, we didn't talk about Egypt. So I hope a year ago what I told you about Egypt was what I've seen from the beginning for Egypt, literally since the very beginning. The military is the strongest social, political, and economic actor in Egypt. Estimates range from somewhere around 13, 14 to upwards of 20% of the Egyptian economy is controlled by the military, right? It's not just that they're a strong military or they have a lot of weapons. They actually own businesses, and they own a lot of businesses. Again, the top end of that estimate, they own 1 in 5, right, modes of economic output in that country. So, right, what does the military want? Well, first of all, the military, for the most part, is popular, right? You saw the public rallying around the military during the Arab Spring. They are deeply enmeshed in the economy, and they're the ones who have traditionally been the power behind a Mubarak or even a Sadat before that. So it's a good question, what's going to happen? So right, the latest move has been they're starting to round up the Muslim Brotherhood. Right, the Brotherhood stood, they got some individuals elected, the military came in, booted out Morsi, and then kind of the military came in and took back over. So the Brotherhood is now, again, under siege. I think you make a good point. Some would disagree with you, but I actually tend to be sympathetic to your point. The Brotherhood historically in Egypt has not been incredibly radical. They're actually very diverse, actually. Yes, you can find segments of the Muslim Brotherhood who say, kill the Israelis, kill the Americans, blow up the world. But the majority of the Brotherhood have just been political opposition. They're not secular by any stretch, but they're not particularly violent. They don't want the overthrow of Israel. They'll respect the peace treaty. They may not want to be best friends with Israel, but they're not going to attack Israel. And so they are, especially again compared to Hamas, to a Hezbollah, they're relatively moderate. Most of that group is relatively moderate. But the danger and what the military feared was the Turkey situation. And this is the analogy I like to think about when I think of Egypt, right? What's the history of Turkey? Well, when Ataturk comes to power, the first thing he does is he suppresses all the Islamic militants, right? He undertakes a westernization program. He puts the military firmly in power. And in 1960, in 1971, in 1980, and to some extent in 1983, the military undertook coups to get out political parties that had come to power that looked a heck of a lot like the Muslim Brotherhood. And so this is what we've seen in Egypt. And I think you'll see this again. I think you might see some gradual easing of political repression in Egypt, maybe a year from now, 2 years from now. The Brotherhood will start to sneak back in, and then I think the military will squash down again. All this is conditional, though, on your question, which is that the military is somewhat being bankrolled by the Saudis, by the Emirates. Because, of course, the Emirates and the Saudis see the Brotherhood, see all these groups as a danger to their own regimes. Never mind the fact that many of the leaders of these groups were educated in Saudi schools. Never mind that. So so they do rely on that source of funding. The question is, what would threaten that source? As you said, could they just wake up one day and say, why are we doing this? It's possible. Although then they fear the precedent that sets, right? Which is that they're going to abandon a state that then might be overrun by Islamic forces, which, especially if you're a Qatar or UAE, you kind of have, or Bahrain even, they have that same fear in the long run, and so they don't like that example being set. You could imagine regime change in a Bahrain where the new groups that come to power, if they're more Shia-oriented, there's a lot of Shia in Bahrain, would cut all of that off from Egypt. So, and then that would be kind of a crisis. But yeah, so I think 5 years from now, you're still going to see the military in power. They're still relatively popular. If they're too repressive, you might see another Tahrir Square type series of incidents happen. The group that I know the least about, and I think is the big wild card, are these kind of pro-Western liberals who are secular. Right? Those were the first people in Tahrir Square. It wasn't the Brotherhood. The Brotherhood had no idea what was going on the first 2 weeks in Egypt. All of a sudden they looked up and there were all these people in Tahrir Square. These were folks who were educated in the West. They were computer programmers. They were on Twitter. They were on Facebook. Right? They were and they wanted democracy. They wanted kind of Western democracy. And that group has disappeared. I don't think they've been arrested. They've not gotten a lot of analysis, I think, in the last year. And they were the ones who started this whole process. And then it kind of got taken away from them. And so the question is, can they find some way to take it back? The problem is they're the small. Of those three groups, of the Brotherhood, of the military, and the kind of younger reformist set, they're the smallest of the group. And they don't have guns, and they don't have churches. So that limits how much you can. They do have the internet, which is good and clearly helped them, but it's hard to mobilize without. Frankly, it can be hard to mobilize without guns and without churches sometimes. So,
are there other questions?
Going back to the deal that you said was pretty close with respect to Israel and Palestine. 3 areas I wondered about related to what you've heard on the negotiation front.
Jerusalem?
Were 1, Jerusalem, 2, right of return,
Sure, yep.
and 3, water. It's my understanding that a lot of the new settlements have been placed strategically related to water and how that would be dealt with.
Right. So, again, I didn't see anything that was going between. I was just kind of told secondhand. Right of return, I think most Palestinians realize yes, there's a lot of rhetoric about right of return. I think most Palestinians realize this is not going to happen. Right, for those of you, right of return is the idea that those Palestinians who had left certain areas could actually have the right to return back to their homes in Israel proper, or what was floated years ago was that they would somehow be paid for this land. I think the most hardcore people who are pushing right of return, that's the solution they're thinking about. I shouldn't say that. There are some people who really truly believe there are going to be 20,000 Arabs moved back to Haifa. So that's not going to happen. But could those 20,000 Arabs be paid, Palestinians be paid for the land they used to own in Haifa? It's a possibility. And that's what people have suggested would be the role of, say, the EU or the United States, right? That could be where we could facilitate the process, is by throwing some money at it. Whether that would go anywhere, I don't know. My understanding was right of return, they hadn't reached a final settlement on it, but that it wasn't. Yeah, they cared much more about Jerusalem. They cared much more about water. Right, those 2 issues were actually more important in negotiations than right of return. On the water side, again, my understanding was that some of the settlements, the more recent settlements that have been kind of strategically placed, would be some of the first ones to go, and that there would be specific kind of sharing of resources on water issues, and that was something that they felt like they could solve. That was something where they can reach some kind of a deal. And actually, randomly was having a conversation with a hydrologist who was there, and he actually was somewhat optimistic that even though it's a problem, there's a general water shortage, and there's a distributional issue, right? He said, I think the distributional issue can be worked out through some means. Again, with the perhaps heroic assumption that both sides will honor that distribution. He was just more concerned about the overall, right? It's getting drier there more generally, which means there's less to then dole out. Jerusalem is another one. I mean, I do think there's this 5% of the settlement area, and I think clearly Jerusalem is the other area. That was something that no one really wanted to talk much about, was how they were going to. They were a little bit hopeful, but basically said, we're not as sure how exactly that's going to. No one really, neither side seems to be interested in this international city idea, which has been around for 70 years now. That Jerusalem becomes kind of an international city. Neither side seems to be happy with that. So I think the question really is about access, and it's about security. And, can you design a system whereby, the Temple Mount and the wall and you can sort of split time. It was pointed out, again, I don't see this happening in the modern era, but, it was pointed out that for centuries, people worked this out, right? I mean, what was the old solution? In the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, I think it was an Armenian family was given the keys to the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, right? And so, right, no one with any particular interest in that conflict, and so a neutral third party held the keys to that church. So people kind of point at that to say, well, look, if they can solve that problem for centuries, we could try to work something out here. But I will tell you, all anyone wanted to talk about in terms of what was being discussed at the time was settlements, and it was aerial security, and then water. But Jerusalem, right of return, neither side seemed worked out. Like they're like, yeah, we need to work that out, but we can. They seemed almost, flippant about the ability to work that out, which I don't know how, but that, and even the Americans said no one seems to be hung up on those issues at the table. That may not be what they're saying to the public, but they said at the table, that doesn't seem to be what people are hung up on.
We'll do one more question.
Yes, your thoughts on Iran and nuclear weapons, and Iran and supporting insurgents in the Middle East.
Sure. Iran's always a good topic. So Iran so we reached this interim deal. Oh, and by the way, when I was in there, the Israelis were really angry about this. They could not believe that we had reached a deal with the Iranians. And what it turns out when you push them, they weren't angry about the terms. They were angry that they weren't invited to the negotiations. And, it's not unreasonable. But there was a reason they weren't invited, which is that, if they would have been at the table, Iran would have been, I think, much less willing to give anything, and Israel would have pushed for a harder deal. I think that, let me first say this deal that's been signed to roll back the Iranian nuclear program, I think is a good deal. I think the $1 million question always, what did Reagan say? Trust but verify, right? It's about verification, and it's about whether we truly believe Iran will live up to the status of this agreement. I will say this, the new leadership in Iran looks to be a little bit different. I'm not saying they're going to be pro-Western and throw out the mullahs anytime soon. But this new leadership in Iran truly does seem to be more interested in having some kind of détente with the West. I think this deal was part of it. What the United States has been stressing to them, both in these nuclear negotiations, but also privately, is the other issue you brought up, which is, look, if you want to be a player in the region, and let's face it, Iran is a major player now in the region. They're, in fact, the major player in the Persian Gulf, partially because of the Iraq War, put them in this position to do this, because it created a huge power vacuum, and they took advantage of that. You need to stop, right? You need to stop running guns to Hezbollah. You need to stop running guns to insurgents. You need to stop supporting Assad. You need to stop supporting Hamas. And Iran that's going to be hard to get Iran to do. You're not going to see Iran do that until you get a change in leadership in Iran. Iran might give up its nuclear program, but they're not going to give up this tool. It's a tool of leverage for them, right? They maintain their status as a major player in the region because they can do this. And they have these supplies, and they know they can arm these insurgents, and they know they can be, just like Putin wants to be number one in the conversation, Iran wants the same thing, right? Now, what might change that? Again, I think a change in leadership. My prediction is that 20 years, 15 to 20 years, you will see another major revolution in Iran. The demographics of Iran are such that the majority of the population is under the age of 20. They don't remember the Shah. They don't remember the American hostages. They don't remember any of that. All they know is they want more IKEAs and they want more Levi's. Right? And they really want to engage more fully in the West. And these were the folks that were out being beaten up, right, was it 5 summers ago now? These were the people who protested the election of Ahmadinejad and were put down and repressed, right? This was the Green Revolution. Now, even if those folks came to power, I'm not saying they would arrest the mullahs. I'm not saying they would all of a sudden, reach out to the West and be happy and say nice things about Israel. But they would be much less aggressive. They would be much less likely to stick their fingers in these other regional conflicts. And they would certainly, they might not even completely scale back their nuclear ambitions. I mean, look, Iran lives in a bad neighborhood, right? People who live in bad neighborhoods buy guns, right? And so, but what it would do is it would scale down their kind of anti-Western behavior. I think that new leadership, younger leadership, would scale down some of the negative things they're doing. The mullahs might put this off. The mullahs might be able to keep down the next generation. I'm not sure, but I do think you're seeing major shifts. You're seeing those same type of communities that brought revolution to Egypt spring up in Iran right now. And I think it'll take longer, but I think it's just a matter of time before you see a major shift within that society, because the young people there, they're not the same things that drive their politics are not the same thing that drives the previous generations or the 2 previous generations' politics there. So,
Thank you, John. We will. Sorry we had to cut off questions. I know if you have more, usually John has a couple of minutes he can stay. Just kids to pick up. Oh, kids to pick up. But we can also, if you want to email us, we can forward him some questions too for a conversation. So I want to thank you all again for being here. Many thanks to members of the Wisconsin Alumni Association and members of Plato. Your membership supports this. And I wish you all a really great summer. If you miss Global Hotspots, you can find the previous lectures online at uwalumni.com/learning. We will look forward to seeing you all again in the fall. Thank you so much.